Elvis, I need you to know something about that day at school. I know, Elvis interrupted gently. I read about your father's ultimatum. You were protecting your future, and your family was protecting their version of your best interests. I wanted to say yes so badly. Betty Sue sobbed. But I was 18 and terrified of losing everything. I chose security over love, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. Betty Sue, you didn't make a mistake. You made the choice you thought you had to make. But more importantly, you protected both of us from something that wasn't meant to be. Sometimes life has to wound us so we can grow stronger. Betty Sue wiped her tears, whispering, "Do you really believe that?" "I do," Elvis replied. "And I believe we were meant to find each other again. Not as teenagers at a school dance, but as two people who understand the cost of pain and the value of compassion." In that moment, something shifted. Their story, once broken by silence, was rewritten with forgiveness. Elvis gave her the support she had been denied for decades. Betty Sue gave him the understanding he had long searched for. The foundation grew rapidly, helping thousands of women and children. Betty Sue's children thrived, her runaway daughter returned, and Elvis performed for survivors in safe houses. Their partnership became legendary, turning pain into purpose. Even after Elvis's death in 1977, the foundation continued its work, saving over 25,000 survivors in decades to come. Betty Sue led the foundation until retirement and lived to 89, remembered as a woman whose heartbreak reshaped countless lives. Their story teaches a truth deeper than romance, that sometimes the greatest love is not the one we lose, but the one that helps us rise again. The report revealed that Betty Sue had tried reaching out to Elvis many times through the years. She had written letters to record companies, showed up at concert halls whenever he performed in Memphis, and even called Graceland several times. None of her efforts had ever made it to him, but there was one item in Joe's file that froze Elvis in place. A letter Betty Sue had written to a local newspaper in 1973, never mailed but discovered among her belongings. "I keep hearing about Elvis Presley's fame and how lonely he seems even with all his success. I went to school with him, and there's something I want him to know. I should have told him 20 years ago when he asked me to the prom in 1953. I wanted more than anything to say yes, but my father would not allow it because Elvis's family was poor and different. My father threatened to cut me off and refused to pay for college if I went with Elvis. I was only 18 and afraid, so I chose security instead of following my heart. I've regretted that decision every single day since. Elvis became the king of rock and roll, and I became stuck in a life I never wished for. I only hope one day he learns that turning him down was the hardest thing I ever did, and that watching his success has been my only light in a very dark life." Elvis stared at the letter, tears falling down his face. She had truly wanted to accept. Her rejection had never been about him, but about her father's prejudice and her own fear. But what Elvis chose to do next would alter both of their lives forever. The following evening, Elvis sat in his Graceland living room and dialed the number Joe had given him. The phone rang several times before a weary voice answered. "Hello? Betty Sue, this is Elvis, Elvis Presley." There was a long pause, then a sharp gasp. "Is this really you?" "It's really me, Betty Sue. I came across the letter you wrote to the paper." Betty Sue broke down in tears at once. "Oh my God, Elvis, I've been trying to reach you for 20 years. I know. I'm so sorry I never got your messages. I wish I had known what you were living through." 22 years later, sitting inside his Graceland music room with that old yearbook in hand, Elvis called for his assistant, Joe Esposito. "Joe, I need you to track someone down for me," he said softly. "Betty Sue Matthews from Memphis. She must be around 40 now." "All right, Elvis, what's this about?" "Just someone I knew back in school. Someone I need to understand." It took less than a day for Joe's contacts to locate Betty Sue Matthews, now known as Betty Sue Crawford. The file they returned with made Elvis's heart sink. Betty Sue had married Jimmy Crawford right after they finished school, just as everyone had assumed she would. But their storybook life had fallen apart quickly. Jimmy had become a heavy drinker who couldn't hold steady work and carried a violent temper. For 2 decades, Betty Sue had survived inside an abusive marriage while raising 4 children and working different jobs just to keep food on the table. She worked as a secretary by day and cleaned offices through the night, all while covering the marks Jimmy left on her. She had never left Memphis, never followed the dreams she once shared about teaching or traveling the world. She lived in a small house in the same area where they had grown up. But now it was run down, barely holding together. What Joe uncovered about Betty Sue's present life shocked Elvis even more. Betty Sue had been following Elvis's career closely for nearly 20 years. Her home was filled with his records, magazine cutouts, and pictures from his concerts. Neighbors said she played his music almost constantly and would tell anyone who listened that she had gone to school with Elvis Presley. But the most painful detail was still to come. As Elvis read further into Joe's report, the story grew darker. Betty Sue's oldest son, Tommy, had been killed in Vietnam 3 years earlier. Her daughter, Lisa, had run away at 16 to escape Jimmy's abuse and had never been heard from since. The 2 younger children were showing clear signs of emotional damage from witnessing years of violence at home. Betty Sue herself had been taken to the hospital twice in the last year, once for injuries caused by Jimmy, and once for a mental breakdown brought on by years of pain and constant pressure. May 14, 1953. 18-year-old Elvis Presley had been working up the courage for weeks to ask Betty Sue Matthews to the senior dance. She was everything he was not, liked by all, wealthy, and from one of Memphis's well-known families. She dated Jimmy Crawford, the star player, and moved through Humes High like a queen. But Elvis had started to believe that maybe his rising name as a young singer might catch her attention. He had been performing at small local spots, and people were beginning to notice his different style. Surely that had to mean something. That Thursday after class, Elvis finally made his move. Betty Sue was at her locker, surrounded by her circle of popular friends. Elvis walked forward, his chest tight, his heart beating so loud he thought the whole hallway could hear. "Betty Sue," he managed, his voice breaking with nerves. "Could I talk to you for a moment?" She turned, a little surprised. The hallway seemed to fall silent all around them. "What is it, Elvis?" "Well, prom's next Saturday, and I was wondering if you'd like to go with me." The pause that followed felt endless. Betty Sue's friends traded looks, barely holding back laughter. Jimmy Crawford, standing nearby, smirked in amusement. Betty Sue's cheeks turned red. Not for herself, but clearly for Elvis. "Elvis, that's very kind," she said gently. "But I'm already going with Jimmy." Elvis nodded quickly, trying to hide his hurt. "Right, of course. I should have guessed." Then Betty Sue's friend, Cheryl, spoke up with words that would haunt Elvis for years. "Betty Sue, why would you even think of going with him? Look at his hair, his clothes, that odd singing he does. He's just a poor kid from the wrong side of town who will never be anything." The group burst into laughter. Betty Sue didn't laugh, but she didn't step in to defend Elvis either. Elvis walked away feeling smaller than ever before. Yet what he didn't realize was that this rejection would spark a fire that would one day make him the most famous performer on earth. What he also didn't know was the hidden reason behind Betty Sue's refusal, and how that truth would one day change everything. Elvis Presley was looking through his old Humes High School yearbook when he came across a picture that made his hands tremble. There she was, Betty Sue Matthews, the lead cheerleader who had once turned him down in front of the whole school back in 1953. What he was about to learn about her life would forever reshape the way he understood love, success, and the hidden cost of being called the king of rock and roll. This isn't simply a story about music or teenage pain. It's about how the people who push us away can sometimes deliver the deepest lessons about what we truly want, and why certain doors close only so others may open. It was a sticky August night in 1975 at Graceland when Elvis chose to go through some old boxes saved from his mother Gladys's home. He had been feeling a wave of nostalgia recently, maybe because of his recent split from Priscilla, and he wished to reconnect with easier days. In a worn cardboard box marked Elvis's school things, he uncovered his 1953 Humes High School yearbook. Turning through the pages, spotting classmates he had hardly thought of in years, he suddenly froze at page 34. There she was in the cheer squad picture. Betty Sue Matthews, leader of the team, homecoming queen, and the girl who had once embarrassed him before half their graduating class. Even in the old black and white snapshot, her looks were striking. Blonde hair curled neatly, a glowing smile, and a steady stance that suggested a life free of doubt. Elvis's finger slowly traced her image in the book. At 40, he was the most famous performer alive. Yet staring at Betty Sue's photo pulled him back to that shy, uncertain 18-year-old who sang in the church choir, but felt unseen in every other place. Betty Sue Matthews, he whispered softly, recalling how her name alone once made his young heart beat faster. But what he learned when he went searching for her story would leave him shocked to his very core.